finally with my book recommendations for books about the Spanish Conquest, or the event that we know as the Spanish Conquest. If you are following HISTORATHON 2024, Quarter 3 is about to start. Quarter 3 covers the period from 1500 to 1820. If you want more information for HISTORATHON, which is a reading event for non-fiction history, you can check out the description. I will link the announcement video and the creator of the readathon, who is Vin at Revenant Reads, so you can check out more information there. But I wanted to upload this video in time for Quarter 3, so that if you want to read about the Spanish Conquest, which would be an event that would fit for this quarter, you can do so. I have been promising this video since ages ago, and finally it's here. I'm not going to lie to you guys, I've been struggling as to how I want to go over this. I have, I think, 5 books I'm going to talk about, and none of them obviously are perfect. None of them are 100% just like the book that I would consider perfect, and for that obviously I would have to write my own book, and I am neither a historian nor an expert in the topic. As I always tell you, I'm just a reader on the internet who shares what she reads. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to timestamp this video into categories. So like the one I would recommend if you only read one, the one that was my favorite but that not a lot of people like, that type of thing. And also I came up with 5 criteria that I am considering while talking about these books and while recommending them. This is important to me because I don't want this video to just be I like this book and I didn't like this book. I want to be as informative as possible because this is a topic that has become very important to me, and I do really want you to pick up a book and know what it is that you are getting into. So I'm taking this video very seriously. I don't always take my videos for booktube very seriously, but I am taking this video very seriously. So that is why I came up with that 5 criteria, so that you know what I'm talking about and what I'm evaluating when recommending these books. I would also highly encourage you to go check out my video or videos about the Conquest. As of now that I am uploading this video, I have my Conquest video part 1 uploaded, and I still have to film my Conquest video part 2. Those videos were done to provide helpful context so that you can pick up whatever book you want from this list, and you will have the background that I consider important, the things that I consider important to think about while reading about the Conquest. So I encourage you to check those videos out no matter which book you pick. So what are the 5 criteria that I'm going to be taking into account for this video? The first one is the focus of the book, and the focus of the book has to be like a general overview of the period between 1519 and 1521, which is what we usually consider the Spanish Conquest, but also providing some context for the before and the after. And the way that is handled, that focus and with the context, that is one of the criteria that I'm going to be talking about. Then the next one is a discussion of the sources. There is a lot of problems with the sources that are used for the Spanish Conquest, and in my opinion, a good history book will acknowledge that, and we'll talk about that, and it will explain how the author has decided to go about with these sources, which sources they are using, how, why, that type of thing. So I think that is very important, and that's the second criteria that I'm going to be taking into consideration. The third is the length and or structure of the book. I think that is important for readability, and I'm not going to tell you like I like this structure, I don't like this structure. I'm going to tell you what it is so that you can decide, oh, this sounds like my type of book, or this doesn't sound like my type of book. Then a book that offers a clear timeline or a clear chronology. There are some books that are heavy on the discussing the topics without really explaining the basics of this happened, then this happened, then this happened. I saw a review that said, oh, this is one of those books that tells me what I shouldn't think about what happened, but it doesn't tell me what happened. And I agree with that review in that if you don't know about a topic and you are reading a book and it goes directly into criticizing stuff without telling you the background of what it is they're criticizing, you can be very confused. So I'm going to talk about that in this video, and that I think would be an important criteria for a beginner book. And then finally, and I think this is the one that is very important to me personally, and that is that it questions the official narratives of the history. You know, if you pick up a book from the 1800s, it's going to have a certain perspective, it's going to be missing new discoveries. So the more recent a book, the better chances that that will happen, that it will question how history has been told. But, you know, also depending on the author is the perspective that you are going to get. Those are the 5 criteria. With that in mind, let's just go ahead with the recommendations. The first book that I'm going to talk about, the category I am assigning it is the one I recommend if it's the only book you pick up. And that is Conquistadors and Aztecs by Stefan Rinke. There is something about the title that I don't love, but it's also not an egregious title. I don't know, that's like a separate comment. There is neither here nor there. But this is the one book that I would recommend you if you only pick one, and is the one that best covers the criteria. It especially made me think of the first 3 points in the criteria that I'm taking into consideration. This is the book that made me think of it, which speaks to how good it does it. So the first point was a focus on the period between 1519 and 1521, while also providing some context for the before and the after. And then the next criteria is a discussion of the sources, and the next one is the length and structure of the book. This book has those 3 elements too in a perfect balance. It is a relatively short book. It has, I think, 300 and something pages. So it's over 300 pages but under 400 pages. I'm going to put the exact number of pages on screen. So for a very, or what I consider to be a very detailed and thorough history book, it is super short. I was honestly very amazed at how Stefan Rinke is able to communicate all that he does in such a short amount of pages, in such a well structured way. So in those 300 and so pages, the book mostly focuses on the period between 1519 and 1521, which is the period between the arrival of Cortes to what is now Mexican territory, to the fall of Tenochtitlan, which is the, let's say, capital of the Aztecs, the Mexica. That is the majority of the book, and I think that if you're picking up like a book about the conquest, that is what you're looking for, especially if you've never read anything about it. So that is the focus of the book, but it does provide some excellent context for the before and the after without it being too overbearing. So it does go into detail about what was happening in Spain, what was happening in Mesoamerica before 1519, and it also talks about all of the years after the fall of Tenochtitlan and how the conquest wasn't immediate, and how all the way up to the 19th century there was still a lot of conflict with the indigenous population and with Spain's power. And Stefan Rinke explains all that, including even the problems with slavery and a lot of detail that is covered in a short amount of pages. And the thing that I'm most surprised about how well it's done is that the majority of the book does take place between 1519 and 1521, but that doesn't make it so that the context is somehow lesser. It still provides excellent before and after context. So that is really great. And then the introduction of the book is all about the handling of the sources. It goes into detail about both the Mesoamerican sources and the Spanish sources, and it goes into the pre-Hispanic sources and the Mesoamerican sources that were done after the conquest, after the 1521. And it goes into detail about every major source that is used in history books. Even if you don't pick this book to read, I would highly encourage you to download the sample and literally just read the introduction of this book, because the introduction of this book will provide you with amazing context for picking up any other book that you want and understanding the sources that you are reading. So check, and check for the first three. Then the last two, there is the clear timeline, clear chronology, which this book provides. It does go into detail, and it does mention like this is what is supposed to have happened according to the sources. But he does question here and there the things that seem a bit far-fetched, or the things that sound suspiciously familiar to other historical events, that are like, this sounds suspiciously similar to what happened in Rome in whatever year. So he does point out those inconsistencies or those question marks without that overpowering the book and becoming the whole point of the book. He goes through the timeline and he adds commentary here and there. As for questioning the official narratives, this book does a great job about that. I would say the only topic that I am not 100% in love of how he does it, but even then I think he's the best author that I've read on the topic, is the topic of how the Aztecs or the Mexica considered the Spanish gods. So I have a lot of problems with that particular narrative, and maybe I will do a video about that someday. And this book relies heavily on that, so he does really push for that idea of, Montezuma believed that Cortes was the return god that he was waiting for. He goes heavily into that. I'm not crazy about it, but also he's the best author that I read, or the most nuanced in how he covers that topic. So that would be my one thing that I didn't love about this book, but honestly, like, everything else is fantastic, and if you pick up this book you won't go wrong, I think, in my opinion. A final note about the audiobook, because I did listen to this book on audiobook and I do want to buy a physical copy to read it again. But the audiobook is fantastic. For all the books or audiobooks that I've read about this topic, this is the best one. And I think it's the second best audiobook that I've heard for HISTORATHON as a whole. It is a fantastic audiobook. The narrator is pretty excellent, and he does this very interesting thing where he, I think he's from a Latin country or from Latin roots. I don't know. His name does sound Latin as in Latin American, I mean. So he can pronounce both the indigenous and the Spanish names really great. Like, he has a great pronunciation, but he does this interesting thing where he mixes it up. So while he's reading, some of the names he pronounces with the correct pronunciation, and some of the names he pronounces with an American accent. And I think he does that to be more listenable to audiences in English. And that is a very interesting thing that I found really works, because I don't like it when there are books that are trying too hard to pronounce with the correct pronunciation, because I feel like it takes you out of the book. You can hear the narrator trying so hard to pronounce correctly that it feels clunky. But also, you don't fault the narrator for doing so, because they're doing their job. They're trying to pronounce correctly, right? But here it's like a natural pronunciation that sounds good, but then also, because it's the mixture of the American accent, it works perfectly. It works super seamlessly, and even for me as a Mexican reader listening this audiobook, I thought the balance was great and super interesting, and I thought it worked because it makes the audiobook experience very seamless. It doesn't throw you off. And yeah, I think an excellent narrator and an excellent audiobook. And of course, when listening to a history book, the thing about an audiobook is that you can't read out the sources and, you know, underline them and go look them up. You are listening to them, and you can remember some but not all. So I do want to pick it up physically to check it out. The next book I'm going to talk about is my personal favorite, but that it's not super well reviewed on Goodreads. And that, based on what I've read in the Historathon Discord of what people look for in history books, I am not super sure that everyone would love this book, but it was my personal favorite. And if you're looking for a radically anti-colonialist book, this is the one. This is the one for you. He is super critical, super radical, super honestly, like, amazing, cathartic read for me. I loved it so much. But I will go through the criteria so that you can understand a bit why it's not so well reviewed on Goodreads. Oh, wait, and the name of the book. This is When Montezuma Met Cortes by Matthew Restall. So, the first point is the focus between 1519 to 1521, but provides context, and then the discussion of the sources, and then the length and structure of the book. Those are the first three criteria, and I feel like this is where people would have problems with the book, and from the reviews I saw on Goodreads, this is the problems that people have with the book. So the title of the book is When Montezuma Met Cortes, and the book, the premise of the book is supposed to be parting from that moment, like parting from the meeting of Cortes and Moctezuma, what happened after, according to Matthew Restall, and why he thinks that everything that has been said in history is wrong. So, the problem is that he's not very structured while making his case, and for someone like me who knows a bit about the history and who is reading the book and knows what he's talking about, it's great. And for someone like me who 100% agrees with him in that the official narrative is, I'm sorry but pretty stupid, that is a great book for me. It's a great read. It's like I'm just, you know, that Meryl Streep gif? That's me reading this book. So for someone like me it works great, but for someone who doesn't know the history and is looking for a book that wants to just learn, okay, but what is supposed to have happened, like let me make my own opinion about the narrative, but I need to know what it is I'm critical about. Like I need to know what happened, I need to know this happened first, this happened second, or this supposedly happened first, this supposedly happened second, which is what Stefan Rinke does in his book, right? He tells you the chronology and he adds question marks whenever necessary. This book is all question marks. And so, if you don't know the history, you can be confused. Now, to be fair, this book has a timeline at the beginning with dates and explanations. So, if you are confused, you can go back to the timeline at the beginning and check it out. But the structure in general of the book is very okay. So I'm going to use a word that people use on Goodreads, that is meandering. Personally, I like books that meander, both in fiction and non-fiction. I like books that are talking about something and then they go on a tangent, and then they go on another tangent, and then they go on another tangent, and then they come back. I do that, clearly, if you've seen my videos. I do that when I talk, I do that when I write, and I love authors who can do that successfully. So I love meandering books, but a lot of people don't. And this book is called Meandering on Goodreads. So what is the structure of the book? The first part of the book is supposedly about the meeting between Cortes and Moctezuma, and he does focus a lot on the meeting, but he does meander a lot. He goes back and forth, and he talks a lot about fiction. So he talks about plays, operas, novels, poems that are written about Cortes, about the conquest, or even talking about fantasy in general. He makes a really interesting case of how the conquest history has been perfect because it was very carefully constructed to be a very compelling narrative. And so it has warfare, it has a hero, it has an anti-hero, it has a love affair, it has all of the things of a good narrative, and that's why it's fascinated people through the ages. And he makes a really compelling case about that, and he uses fiction to do so. And I saw people in Goodreads had a lot of problems with that, with him talking about songs, operas, poems, novels, epics, to make his point about how history has been told. I personally loved that. I loved that. I think it's a super interesting discussion, and I do think that history impacts culture, and that it's like a circle. The way we tell history impacts the way we tell stories, and vice versa, and it goes round and round. And I don't think you can separate history from culture, from the world. And so I like authors who bring cultural elements into history analysis. And he talks a lot about the Mexican American War, and he parallels that with the conquest. So he does bring other topics to create parallels. I personally love that. Some people don't. And if you are just trying to learn the basics and want to cover the basic grounds of, okay, what is supposed to have happened, he doesn't provide a lot of just like going to the basics. Then the second part of the book is all about Cortes, and this part is where he lost me a bit. Even if I'm not a Cortes fan, even if I'm not like, oh, they are heroes, I still think that the way that this topic was treated took away a bit from the rest of the book, because he goes heavy into Cortes. And as much as I'm not a fan, he has to have done something right to pull off whatever it is that he pulled off. So you lose me a bit when you say he wasn't he was dumb and he was just like a clown, which I do think he was a little bit in some cases. But again, it's nuance. It's how you treat the topics, and this is where he lost me. But then the third part is about the after of the fall of Tenochtitlan, and specifically about slavery in Mesoamerica. And that part was super interesting, and I learned a lot of things that I didn't know about. So it is a bit over the place. The title is a bit misleading, and if you know already about the conquest, I would highly encourage you to read this book to have this critical perspective about it. And as I said, if you are looking for a radically anti-colonialist book, this is the one for you, and you can just read the timeline at the beginning of the book and check out my conquest videos, and honestly, Google or whatever it is you're having questions about, and go ahead and pick up this book, because honestly, in my opinion, it's absolutely fantastic. The epilogue of this book almost made me cry, and I don't think that had ever happened to me in a history book before. The next book I'm going to talk about is the one where I hated the first half, hated it with a passion, but then the second half was fantastic. And that is Fifth Son by Camilla Townsend. The subtitle of this book is A New History of the Aztecs. And here is where I misjudged the book initially. I have to pay attention to subtitles, these or titles. This has happened to me with several books this year, where I go into a book thinking it's going to be about something, and then it's about something else, and then I look at the title or the subtitle and I think, well, they told me what it was going to be about, and I just made my own opinion about it. And this is one of those books because it's a new history of the Aztecs, and because when we think about the Aztecs, and I'm putting it in air quotes because the correct name is Mexica, but anyway, not going into that, but when thinking about the Aztecs or the Mexica, you usually think about the conquest, or I do. And here is where I got a bit called out for my own biases and my own prejudices, because this is not a history of the conquest. This is a history of the Aztecs, of the Mexica, of the people, of the Mexica people. And yes, the Spanish Conquest, the event that we know as the Spanish Conquest, is one of the things that happened to them, but it's not all they are. So that is this book. And so it was my mistake going into this book, assuming it was going to be just about the conquest, because it's about the Aztecs, the Mexica, as the subtitle suggests. So going into this book, you have to know that, because it's not going to be about just the conquest. However, and here is my big caveat with this book, the problem with this premise is that there is a lot that we don't know about pre-Hispanic era Aztecs, Mexica. There is a problem with the sources. There is very few pre-Hispanic codexes, and even the ones that exist have problems, because the kings, the emperors, the people in power, they had a history of writing their own history, which I think that's no different than the history of the world. Like, honestly, European, emperors, kings did that too. They wrote history as they pleased. If you want a great fiction book that is satiring that topic, check out Baudolino by Umberto Eco. But so the Aztec Mexica kings, there are some infamous kings who literally burned all the codexes in existence, and he created his own. So even the pre-Hispanic codexes that we have can be questionable about the history of the Mexica. Between codexes, between ethnographic studies, between archaeological studies, there has been a reconstruction of the history of the Mexica that is debated about, that not every historian agrees with the history. Some historians think one thing, some historians think another. There is a legend about the origin of the Aztec and the Mexica that is heavily debated. And the problem with this book is that in trying to write a new history of the Aztecs, you have to consider the problem with the pre-Hispanic sources, and I feel like Camilla Townsend just takes a lot of things for granted and talks about a lot of things as if they are fact. That and doesn't talk about the problem with the sources, at least not at the beginning of the book. And so I had a lot of problems with that at the beginning. And so the first criteria, which is the focus of the 1519 to 1521, obviously is not here in this book. And if you just want to read about the event of the conquest, pick up Stefan Rinke's book instead. This one goes literally from the crossing of the Bering Strait to all the way up to, I think, the 19th or even 20th century. Now, I personally think that going back to the crossing of the Bering Strait was a bit, let's say, questionable. And so the whole premise of the beginning of the book is that because the Aztecs Mexica developed after the crossing of the Bering Strait, they were inferior to the Europeans through no fault of their own. So I do think that Camilla Townsend can come across as a bit condescending. There was a review that I read that said that it reads like a white woman writing history, and it does. She does come across a bit of like, oh, bless their hearts sometimes, and because she goes all the way back. So the first criteria, that focus is not it focuses more on the before and the after. Let's just say that it focuses more on the before and the after than the actual time of Cortes, which I think is what a lot of people are interested in when coming to this topic. Now, another criteria is the discussion of the sources, and at the beginning of the book, she doesn't talk about the problem with the sources, and I don't particularly love how she handles the lack of sources for the pre-Hispanic period. She says so in the introduction that what she does is that she picks and chooses from different accounts and different sources, and she creates small historical fiction type narratives to explain certain periods. And in those historical fiction like narratives, she doesn't tell you which sources she used. Now, it might be a problem of that I read the audiobook instead of the physical book. However, I will say that neither for the Matthew Restall book nor the Stefan Rinke book did I have this problem, even if I listened to them. I never felt like there was a question about which sources were used, even if I was listening and didn't have the actual note. And with this book, I did feel there was a problem. So, with the caveat that maybe it wasn't a great audiobook and that in the physical copy you do get the sources, I didn't like that in those historical fiction narratives, she tells you that she picks and chooses different sources from different time periods, from different geographic regions, from different peoples, and she mixes them to create one narrative as if it's one person in one time period in one geographic area. I don't like that, and I don't like that she doesn't say, I took this part from this, and this part from this, and this part from this. And then the audiobook is terrible. Terrible. I think this is one of the worst audiobooks I've ever listened to, including fiction. The narrator chooses to narrate the historical fiction bits as if they were fiction, and so she gives voices to historical figures. So you know how narrators, when narrating a novel, they will create voices for the different characters. That's what she does here, but they are historical figures. So she will create a voice for Montezuma, and she will be like, people, Aztecs, please, you have to rise up against the Spanish. I'm not even exaggerating, that's the way the audiobook goes. It is beyond cringy, beyond cringy. I don't know what was the thought process behind that choice, but it's awful in my opinion. And she does an accent for the historical figures. So the Aztecs, the Mexica have accents. It's so weird. It's so weird. So I think that maybe also if I was reading the book physically instead of listening to it, maybe I wouldn't have had such a problem with the historical fiction bits, but I still think I would, because she takes a lot of things for granted. She goes to a lot of cliches. I think in the Historathon Discord, I even said that there were scenes where you could picture the Aztec princesses wearing like a gold bikini, like a old Hollywood movie. It's really bad. It's really bad. So the first half of the book goes like that because there's a lot of problem with the sources, and she just picks and chooses and creates narratives out of them. I personally don't like that, and I think that the history she tells can be very questionable. But then the second part of the book focuses on the Nahua intellectuals of the of after the conquest. The Nahua are the people that spoke the Nahuatl, which was the language of the Aztecs. So, you know, we can't really talk about Mexica people in present day. We talk about Nahua. So, you know, maybe that's also a bit questionable to say that there are Mexica living to this day. There are Nahua people living to this day, that yes, but not Mexica as such, not Aztecs, right? But so the second half focuses on the intellect, the Nahua intellectuals of the time after the conquest, who decided to write the histories of their people, of their ancestors, of the Aztecs, of the Mexica. Now, the second section of that book doesn't have the problem of lack of written sources, because by that time we do have written sources. We do have books that we can write, that we can read to this day, written by Nahua intellectuals of the time. This second part I thought was absolutely fantastic, and I think that it is very commendable, and here's where I can see why she has won awards and stuff for this book, because no one is talking about that part, and the people who do focus mostly on the slavery and all the awful things that the Spanish did. Now, obviously there is stuff about that in this book. There's a lot of atrocities discussed in the second half of the book, but the focus is mostly these historical men who, after the conquest, decided to write out their histories, and I think that is fantastic. So, you know, you can pick this book up, skim through the first part, just so you can, you know, get the background if you want, and then read out the second half, which is 5 million stars for the second half of the book, and negative stars for the first half of the book. It is the most inconsistent of all the ones that I've read, but I almost wish it was like in 2 tomes, so I could recommend the second one, because I do think it's super important. But the first one is just, oh my god, the first one is just so bad. Now that I've read the second part, I am curious to read, like, buy a Kindle edition or a physical edition of this book and read it through and see if maybe the awful audiobook was the reason why I hated it so much. But still. Also, it has some great epilogues where it discusses the usage of the sources, the reasoning behind why she does the narratives that she does, the decisions that she makes, and those epilogues are fantastic. Those appendices are fantastic. I wish they were at the beginning of the book, because if I had read those at the beginning, I would have gone into the book knowing what she's trying to do and appreciating what she's trying to do. But they're at the end, so there is a discussion about that, but at the end. The length and structure, that is good. It has a very clear chronology. It starts with the crossing of the Bering Strait, and it ends to, I think, the present day, and it does follow like a clear chronology. And then questioning the official narrative, here is where it's funny, because even though she's writing a new history of the Aztecs, she is one of the ones that most follows the official narrative, because of the problems that there are with the sources that are indigenous but that are done post-conquest, which, for many political reasons that I won't go into in this video, they did follow the official narratives, and so the beginning part is the most cliche, stereotypical official narrative that you will read, even though it's supposed to be a new history. Here is where the Matthew Restall quote that I read you in my Conquest video comes to play, because it's not about the sources that you use, it's about the questions that you ask while using whatever source you choose to use. The final book in English I'm going to talk about is Conquest by Hugh Thomas. It has a subtitle, but it's a long subtitle and I can't remember it at the moment. I haven't been giving you the publication years for these books, but this is the oldest one of the bunch. This was published in the 90s, and I think you can tell. This is a book that I've been hot and cold with. I love it and then I hate it, and then I love it and then I hate it. And I think that as a history book, you know, that is thoroughly researched and sourced, it is very good, and no one can deny that it's a riveting read. But there are some problems with his visions. I'm just going to go ahead and refer to my handy list of the criteria. Okay, so the first criteria is the focus of 1519 to 1521, providing some before and after context. Now, fair note, I haven't finished this book because it's 800 pages long, and I read a lot of books at the same time, and I haven't finished it yet. But I have read half of it, and I think it's enough for me to get an idea to review it in terms of the criteria, but know that I haven't finished it. So I can't tell you how much detail he will go to for the after 1521, but judging from how he writes, I would assume that he will go into heavy detail because he goes into heavy detail of the before, both for the Spanish and for the Mexica, for the Aztecs. He has an entire section of the history before Spain, of the history before 1519 of Spain and of the Aztecs, the Mexica. I would argue, if you are wanting to know the basics and if you are wanting to read for the first time about the topic, I would argue it's too much. It is, I thought, was fascinating, and for the Spanish history part, I have learned some really fascinating things, and I think it's super fun. For the Mexica Aztec history, I have also learned a lot of things, but he also goes into some written in the 90s perspectives. So yeah, if you want to just if this is the first book you're going to pick up, I think you have to know it's 800 pages long and it goes into heavy detail. Which again, I think for a introductory book might be a bit much. Maybe you're like, I just want to know what happened after Cortes arrived to what is now Mexican territory, and his war with the Aztecs, what happened there. You will have to read for a lot of hundreds of pages before you even get to Cortes arriving to the shores of what is now Mexican territory. Yeah, so it's super long as regards to that. as for the discussion of the sources, it is really, really well noted and sourced. So, like, every single detail that he mentions has a note that you can refer to and you can see what the source is. However, you don't get the explanation for the problems of the sources. He uses a lot of Spanish sources that he takes for granted. A lot of things that I highlight, and I'm like, can we trust this? And he doesn't explain. You can tell he is very clearly a fan of Spanish history. He has even a trilogy of books about that. So he is very clearly leaning towards the Spanish, and so there isn't, and so he uses, Cortes's letters and other accounts as if they were fact, which is a problem. Now, if you read the introduction for Stefan Rinke's book, you can read this one and you can discern where things might be a bit questionable, or as I said with Stefan Rinke, the details where you think, question mark. As for the length and structure and the clear timeline and chronology, so the structure is pretty great and a very clear timeline chronology. It follows a chronological narrative account. That is great. The length is a bit much. I am going to finish the book because I have learned some very interesting details. I think I want to finish it. But here's where I ran into some problems. The first part was great because he was talking about like the background of the Aztecs, which there's some questionable stuff, but like you can read it and you can discern for yourself. And the Spanish stuff was fantastic, super fun, learned a ton. But once Cortes reaches what is now Mexico, and you have now like the two cultures clashing, that is where his view as a man of a certain age writing in the 90s comes across really heavy. He refers to historical women as that lady. He is really, really, really hateful towards Malintzin. He discusses her physical appearance. There is literally a paragraph where he's like, well, she's supposed to be very beautiful, but like, I've seen the codexes and I don't think she's that pretty. Like, he goes into stuff like that's where I'm finding it difficult to continue, and that's why I haven't finished the book. So I think I do want to finish it, but I'm struggling with this part. So it's kind of like the opposite of the Camilla Townsend, where the first half was fantastic and I'm having problems with the second half. But in terms of the length, it is overly long, I think, if you just want to learn the basic stuff. If you want to read an over 800-page book about it, then by all means, I would rather you pick this up than something written even before this book. And then the final point, which is the questioning official narratives, is obviously a hard no. He doesn't question it, he follows it to the T, to the letter. So yeah, that has to do both with the fact that he was writing in the 90s and with the fact that he's clearly a fan of the Spanish. So you won't find questioning of the narratives in this book, which for me is very important. But anyway, to each each person has their own criteria. So there you go. Those are the books. I am going to stop talking because I literally have no voice left and I'm hungry, and this is the third video I'm filming today, and I have a lot of work today and physiotherapy in the evening. So, I have to go. But thank you so much for watching. Any questions, let me know in the comments. I still have to do my Conquest Part 2 video and my mid-year freakout Historathon edition, and whatever else video I come up with. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you when I see you, and in the meantime I wish you happy reading.